The rain hammered against the glass walls of the downtown bus shelter like bullets, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller pieces before sliding down in defeated streams. Marcus Chen pulled his worn denim jacket tighter around his shoulders, but the cold still bit through the fabric like it had teeth. Beside him, pressed against the metal bench, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 sat trembling in nothing but a thin sweater and ripped jeans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She had been there when he arrived 20 minutes ago, and she'd been shaking the entire time. Her dark hair hung in wet strands across her face, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that look before in the mirror during his own worst nights sleeping rough behind restaurant dumpsters, when the cold felt like it might actually kill him. The girl's phone buzzed against the bench. She grabbed it with fingers so stiff they could barely bend, squinting at the screen through the cracked glass. Whatever she read there made her shoulders drop even further, and she let out a sound that was half sob, half bitter laugh. Marcus watched her wipe her nose with the back of her hand, the simple gesture so defeated it made something crack open in his chest. Without thinking, he stood and slipped off his jacket. It wasn't much, faded blue denim with a small tear near the left elbow where his daughter had accidentally snagged it with her bike pedal, but it was warm from his body heat and dry on the inside. "Hey," he said softly, extending the jacket toward her, "you need this more than I do." The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were dark brown, wide with surprise, and something that looked like wariness. She shook her head quickly. "No, I'm fine. Thank you, but I can't take your coat." Marcus didn't pull his hand back. "Look, I've got a daughter about your age. She'd haunt me forever if she knew I left someone sitting here freezing." He smiled, the kind of gentle expression that had always worked on his 8-year-old Emma when she was scared of thunderstorms. "It's just a jacket. I've got another one at home." That was a lie. This was his only jacket, the one he'd bought 3 years ago from a thrift store for $12 when he'd finally saved enough for winter clothes. But the girl didn't need to know that. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have convinced her, because she reached out with shaking hands and accepted the jacket. "Thank you," she whispered, immediately wrapping it around herself. "You don't know how much this means." Marcus sat back down, already feeling the cold seep through his thin flannel shirt, but watching color return to the girl's face made the discomfort worth it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie," she said, pulling the jacket closer. "Sophie Williams." "Marcus, you waiting for someone?" Sophie's expression darkened. "I was, but apparently plans change." She held up her phone, showing him a text message that simply read, "Can't pick you up. Figure it out yourself." Marcus felt anger flash through him, hot and protective. What kind of person left a kid stranded in weather like this? "Where do you need to go?" "Nowhere now," Sophie said, her voice small. Home isn't really an option. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He recognized that tone, the careful way she spoke around the edges of something painful. He'd used that same voice when he was 17 and aging out of foster care, when home was just a word other people got to have. Marcus Chen had learned early that life didn't come with guarantees. His parents had died in a house fire when he was 15, leaving him to navigate the foster system until he turned 18, and was released into a world that seemed designed to chew up kids like him. For 3 years he'd bounced between shelters, park benches, and the occasional couch offered by someone who took pity on him. He'd worked construction jobs when he could get them, saved every penny, and slowly clawed his way towards something that resembled stability. Then he met Sarah at a community college, where he was taking night classes in electrical engineering. She was studying to be a teacher, had grown up in a stable home with parents who loved her, and somehow saw something in Marcus worth believing in. They married young, maybe too young, but for 5 years it felt like Marcus had finally found his place in the world. Sarah got pregnant with Emma, and Marcus threw himself into building the kind of life he'd never had. Steady work, a small apartment, Sunday dinners where they actually sat at a table together. Then Sarah got sick. The cancer came fast and merciless. eating through their savings faster than it ate through her body. Marcus worked 3 jobs trying to keep up with medical bills, but nothing was enough. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding his hand and making him promise to take care of their little girl. That was 3 years ago. Emma was 8 now, and Marcus was still keeping that promise, even when it meant choosing between groceries and the electric bill, even when it meant wearing the same jacket for 3 winters in a row, because Emma needed new shoes more than he needed to be warm. He worked maintenance at Riverside Elementary during the day, which meant Emma could attend the same school where he mopped floors and fixed broken water fountains. The other parents sometimes looked at him with pity when they saw him in his janitor's uniform, but Marcus had learned to let those looks roll off him. What mattered was that Emma was safe, fed, and loved. Sophie Williams had never wanted for anything material in her life, but she'd been starving for something money couldn't buy since she was old enough to understand that her parents saw her as an inconvenience rather than a daughter. Victoria and Richard Williams were titans of industry, their names on buildings and charity galas, their faces in business magazines. They'd had Sophie late in life, more accident than plan, and they'd never quite figured out what to do with a child who needed more than a trust fund and private school tuition. When Sophie was 12, they'd shipped her off to boarding school in Switzerland, telling themselves it was for the best education money could buy. Really, it was just easier than having to remember they had a daughter. Sophie had spent the last 4 years ping-ponging between expensive schools and brief, awkward visits home, where her parents treated her like a particularly difficult houseguest. She'd learned to be invisible, to need nothing, to expect less. This semester, she'd been attending Westfield Academy, a prestigious prep school an hour outside the city. But yesterday, she'd been expelled for something she didn't do, caught in the wrong place when another student was dealing drugs. The school's zero-tolerance policy didn't care about context or the fact that Sophie had been trying to talk the other girl out of it. She'd called her parents from the headmaster's office, expecting them to fight for her, to demand an investigation, to do what parents were supposed to do. Instead, her mother had sighed like Sophie was a stain on her calendar and said they'd figure something out later. Sophie had taken the bus into the city, thinking her Uncle James might help. He was her father's younger brother, the black sheep of the Williams family, who'd always been kind to her during the few times they'd met. But when she'd arrived at his address, she'd found an empty apartment with a for rent sign in the window. That's when she'd gotten the text from her so-called friend Melissa, who'd promised to pick her up and let her crash for a few days. Another lie from another person who decided Sophie wasn't worth the trouble. So here she was, sitting in a bus shelter in a storm, wearing a stranger's jacket because he had more kindness in his heart than her own family had ever shown her. Marcus glanced at Sophie, noting how she'd stopped shivering but still looked lost. The bus schedule posted on the wall showed the last. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Route ending in 15 minutes, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. "Listen," he said carefully, "I know you don't know me, and I'm not trying to be weird or anything, but I've got a little girl at home, and if she was out here alone in weather like this, I'd hope someone would help her." He paused, choosing his words. "You could come home with me tonight. Hot meal, warm place to sleep, and tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." Sophie turned to stare at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You'd do that? For a complete stranger?" Marcus shrugged. "You're not a stranger anymore. You're Sophie, and you need help." The simplicity of it, the matter-of-fact way he said it, made Sophie's eyes burn with tears she'd been holding back all day. When was the last time someone had seen her as a person worth helping? Not because of her last name or her parents, money, but just because she was human and hurting. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, the words scraping her throat raw. "Then, it's settled," Marcus said, standing as the bus finally appeared through the rain. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." The bus ride to Marcus's neighborhood took them through parts of the city Sophie had never seen before. Narrow streets lined with small houses that had seen better decades. Corner stores with hand-painted signs. Playgrounds where the swings squeaked and the paint was peeling, but kids still played there anyway. Marcus's apartment was on the second floor of a converted house, up a set of wooden stairs that creaked under their feet. Sophie could hear a television playing cartoons through the thin walls, and when Marcus unlocked the door, a small voice called out from inside. "Daddy, you're late!" "Sorry, baby girl." Marcus called back, gesturing for Sophie to follow him inside. I brought a friend who needed help. The apartment was tiny, but spotlessly clean. A small living room with a couch that had been repaired with duct tape, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, and what looked like 1 bedroom. Everything was worn, but cared for. The kind of place where people made do with what they had and found ways to make it home. Emma Chen appeared in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, all dark pigtails and curious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked at Sophie with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old, taking in the borrowed jacket and damp hair. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, because that's the first thing her father had taught her to notice about people. Not what they looked like, or what they wore, but whether they were hurting. Sophie felt something break open in her chest. This child, this little girl in pajamas printed with cartoon dinosaurs, had shown her more immediate concern than Sophie's own parents had in years. "I'm better now," Sophie said, and meant it. Marcus moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling ingredients from cabinets that barely stayed closed and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly. "Hope you like grilled cheese and tomato soup," he said over his shoulder. "It's not fancy, but it's warm." Sophie watched him work, this man who'd given a stranger his only jacket and brought her into his home without hesitation. She thought about the formal dining room in her parents' house, where meals were served by staff, and conversation was limited to discussions of stock prices and social obligations. This felt more like family than anything she'd ever known. Emma had appointed herself Sophie's guide to the apartment, showing her the bookshelf made from stacked milk crates, the collection of library books they returned and renewed religiously, the small television that got 3 channels on good days. Everything was makeshift and secondhand, but it was theirs. "Daddy fixes everything," Emma explained, pointing to a lamp that had been rewired with visible pride. "He says if something's broken, that just means it needs love and attention." Sophie thought about how broken she felt, how much love and attention she'd been missing, and wondered if Marcus's philosophy applied to people too. Dinner was the best meal Sophie had eaten in months, not because of the food, but because of the way Emma chattered about her day at school, the way Marcus listened to every word like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard, the way they included Sophie in their conversation like she'd always been part of their small family. After Emma went to bed, Marcus and Sophie sat on the couch with cups of tea made from bags that had been used twice. The storm had finally passed, leaving the city washed clean and quiet outside their windows. "Thank you," Sophie said quietly. "I know you didn't have to do any of this." Marcus smiled, the same gentle expression he'd worn at the bus stop. "My wife always said kindness doesn't cost anything, but it's worth everything." "Your wife?" "Emma's mom. She passed away 3 years ago." Marcus's voice carried the kind of pain that never fully heals, but learns to live alongside love. "She would have liked you." Sophie felt tears threaten again. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay. She taught me that we're all just walking each other home in this life. Sometimes that means sharing your jacket. Sometimes it means sharing your couch." They talked until late, Sophie finding herself telling Marcus about boarding schools and empty houses, about parents who saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. Marcus listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that showed he was really hearing her. In return, he told her about growing up in foster care, about meeting Sarah and learning what home could feel like, about building a life from nothing and losing pieces of it and somehow finding ways to keep going. "Emma's my anchor," he said, glancing toward the bedroom where his daughter slept. "She reminds me every day that love is the only thing that really matters." Sophie thought about her own childhood, about nannies and drivers and boarding schools, about birthday parties where the staff outnumbered the friends she'd been allowed to invite. She'd had everything money could buy, and nothing her heart actually needed. "You're a good father," she said, and Marcus's smile was worth more than all her parents' money. That night, Sophie slept on the couch under a quilt Emma had helped pick out at a thrift store, wearing an oversized t-shirt Marcus had found for her. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not because of walls or security systems or bank accounts, but because she was surrounded by people who cared whether she was okay. She woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of Emma practicing piano on a small keyboard, the volume turned down low so it wouldn't wake their guest. Marcus was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with the same careful attention he gave everything else. "Morning," he said when he saw her sitting up. "Hope you like blueberry. They're Emma's favorite." Sophie couldn't remember the last time someone had made her breakfast. "They smell amazing." Over pancakes, Emma told Sophie about her school, about the art project she was working on for Mother's Day even though she didn't have a mother anymore, about the book she was reading about a girl who lived in a tree. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Sophie found herself laughing at the 8-year-old's dramatic retelling of playground politics. "Sophie could walk with us to school," Emma suggested, looking hopefully between her father and their guest. "If she wants to." Marcus glanced at Sophie. "You don't have to. I know you probably have things to figure out." Sophie did have things to figure out. She needed to call her parents, needed to find a new school, needed to navigate the complicated world of being 16, and essentially homeless despite having wealthy parents. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, at Marcus's gentle encouragement, she realized she wasn't ready to leave this bubble of kindness yet. "I'd like that," she said. The walk to Riverside Elementary took them through a neighborhood that was clearly struggling but trying. Community gardens planted in vacant lots, murals painted on the sides of buildings, kids walking to school with backpacks held together by duct tape, but laughter still bubbling out of them. Marcus moved through it all like he belonged, stopping to check on Mrs. Rodriguez's leaky front steps, waving to the crossing guard who knew Emma by name, picking up a piece of trash and depositing it in the next bin they passed. "Daddy says taking care of your neighborhood is like taking care of your family," Emma explained to Sophie as they watched Marcus help an elderly man with his grocery bags. At the school, Emma hugged her father goodbye with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd never doubted she was loved. "See you after school, Daddy." "Bye, Sophie." Sophie watched the little girl skip into the building, her dinosaur backpack bouncing with each step, and felt something shift in her chest. This was what childhood was supposed to look like. This was what love looked like. "She's amazing," Sophie said as they watched Emma disappear into the crowd of children. "She's everything," Marcus agreed simply. They spent the morning walking through the city, Marcus showing Sophie places that mattered to him. The community center where he and Sarah had met. The park where Emma took her first steps. The library where they spent Saturday mornings because it was free and warm and full of stories. Sophie found herself seeing the city differently through Marcus's eyes. Not as a place to escape from or endure, but as a community of people doing their best with what they had. It was messier than the sterile perfection of her parents' world, but it was also more real. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said as they sat on a bench outside the library. "Why did you really help me last night?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching pigeons fight over breadcrumbs someone had scattered on the sidewalk. "When I was about your age, I was sleeping in a park during a snowstorm. I thought I might actually freeze to death. This older homeless guy, couldn't have had much of anything, came over and gave me his sleeping bag. Just like that." He smiled at the memory. I asked him why, and he said, "Because you're somebody's kid, and somebody's kid shouldn't freeze." I never forgot that. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. "What happened to him?" "I don't know. I never saw him again. But I carry his kindness with me. Every time I have a chance to help someone, I think about that sleeping bag." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city move around them. Sophie thought about the text from her parents that she'd been ignoring all morning, about the voicemail from her headmistress, about the complicated mess her life had become. But for the first time, those problems felt manageable, not because they'd gotten smaller, but because she wasn't facing them alone anymore. "I should probably call my parents," she said reluctantly. Marcus nodded. "Want me to stay while you do it?" The offer was simple, but it meant everything. Sophie had never had someone offer to stay while she did something hard. The phone call went about as well as expected. Her mother's voice was crisp and efficient, discussing Sophie like she was a business problem to be solved. There was talk of military school, of therapeutic boarding programs, of consequences for poor choices. Sophie hung up feeling smaller than she had in the bus shelter, but Marcus was there, steady and present, and that made all the difference. "They want to send me away again," she said, her voice hollow. "Where?" "Someplace in Utah. Military-style program for troubled teens." Sophie laughed bitterly. I've never even been in real trouble before. I just exist in the wrong places at the wrong times. Marcus's jaw tightened. When? They're driving up tomorrow to collect me. Mom said I should be. Grateful they're giving me another chance. The unfairness of it made Marcus's chest burn with anger. This girl, who'd spent one night on his couch and already felt like family, was being shipped off by people who couldn't be bothered to understand what she actually needed. Is that what you want? He asked gently. Sophie shook her head. I want to stay here. I want to help Emma with her. Don't work and eat pancakes for breakfast and have someone care if I'm okay. Her voice broke. I want to belong somewhere. Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a decision that felt both impossible and inevitable. What if I told you there might be another option? Sophie looked at him with hope and skepticism warring in her dark eyes. What do you mean? I mean, what if you didn't have to go? What if there was a way for you to stay? Before Sophie could ask what he meant, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from the school. Emma had fallen on the playground and needed to be picked up. The nurse didn't think it was serious, but they wanted a parent to check her over. I have to go get Emma, Marcus said, already standing. Come with me? At the school nurse's office, Emma sat on a plastic chair with an ice pack pressed to her knee. Tears dried on her cheeks, but her chin set with determination. When she saw her father, her face lit up. Daddy, I'm okay. I just tripped during tag. Marcus knelt in front of his daughter, gently examining the scrape on her knee. Does it hurt? A little, but I didn't cry very much, Emma said proudly, then noticed Sophie behind her father. Sophie, did you come to rescue me too? The casual way Emma included Sophie in her circle of people who might rescue her made something warm bloom in Sophie's chest. This child, who barely knew her, already saw her as someone who cared. Of course, Sophie said, sitting in the chair next to Emma. How are you feeling, brave girl? Emma beamed at being called brave and launched into a detailed account of the playground incident while the nurse cleaned and bandaged her scrape. Sophie found herself completely absorbed in the 8-year-old's dramatic storytelling, asking questions and making sympathetic noises in all the right places. Marcus watched the interaction with growing certainty. Sophie wasn't just kind to Emma, she genuinely enjoyed her company. And Emma, who was usually shy with new people, was chattering away like Sophie was her favorite person in the world. That evening, after Emma had shown Sophie her art supplies, and they'd worked together on a drawing of a family of dinosaurs, Marcus tucked his daughter into bed while Sophie cleaned up the kitchen. I like Sophie, Emma said as Marcus pulled her covers up to her chin. She listens really good, and she knows all about art. She does seem pretty great, Marcus agreed. Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking, Daddy, is Sophie going to stay with us? Marcus felt his heart squeeze. I don't know, baby girl. That's complicated. Could she be like my big sister? Emma asked with the straightforward logic of childhood. I always wanted a big sister. After Emma fell asleep, Marcus found Sophie sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. Her parents had called 3 more times and sent a series of increasingly sharp text messages about responsibility and, quote, consequences. They're really angry, Sophie said without looking up. Marcus sat beside her. At you, or at the situation? What's the difference? Everything, Marcus said quietly. Good parents get angry at situations that hurt their kids. They don't get angry at their kids for being hurt. Sophie finally looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't think they're good parents. Marcus wanted to argue, to give her some hope that her parents might surprise her, but he'd seen too much in his life to offer false comfort. No, he said gently. I don't think they are either. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of that admission settling between them. Outside, the city hummed with its evening rhythm. Sirens and car horns, and the distant sound of music from someone's open window. Emma asked if you could be her big sister, Marcus said eventually. Sophie's breath caught. She did? She's never asked that about anyone before. Emma's pretty careful about who she lets into her heart. I love her already, Sophie said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I know that sounds crazy, but I do. And I love this. She gestured around the small apartment. I love feeling like I matter to someone. Marcus turned to face her fully. You do matter. You matter to Emma, and you matter to me. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than any of the expensive gifts Sophie's parents had ever given her. "What you said earlier," Sophie said carefully, "about there being another option. What did you mean?" Marcus took a deep breath. What he was about to suggest was crazy, legally complicated, and potentially impossible. But looking at this girl who'd brightened his daughter's entire world in the span of 24 hours, who'd helped with homework and dishes and bedtime stories like she'd been born to be part of their family, he knew he had to try. "I mean," he said slowly, "what if you didn't have to leave? What if there was a way for you to stay here, with us, legally?" Sophie stared at him. "Are you talking about foster care, emancipation, legal guardianship? I don't know all the options yet, but there have to be options." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "You're 16. You're not a child, but you're not an adult either. There have to be ways for teenagers to choose where they live when their home situation isn't working." Hope bloomed in Sophie's chest, bright and terrifying. "You would do that? You'd try to help me stay?" "Sophie!" Marcus reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "In one day you've become part of our family. Emma adores you. You fit here. If there's a legal way to make this work, then yes, I would absolutely try." Sophie started to cry then, not the bitter tears of abandonment she'd shed in the bus shelter, but tears of relief and gratitude and something that felt suspiciously like joy. For the first time in her life, someone was fighting to keep her instead of looking for ways to send her away. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that would change everything. Marcus called in sick to work and spent hours on the phone with social services, family court, and legal aid societies. Sophie sat beside him, holding Emma on her lap while the 8-year-old worked on homework, all of them listening to one side of conversations that would determine their future. The legal landscape was complicated, but not impossible. Sophie was old enough to have some say in her living situation, especially if she could demonstrate that her current guardians were neglectful or harmful. The fact that her parents had essentially abandoned her when she was expelled, leaving her homeless and without support, worked in their favor. There would be investigations, court appearances, social worker visits. It wouldn't be easy or quick. But it was possible. Sophie's parents arrived that afternoon, driving up in a sleek black car that looked out of place on Marcus's street. Victoria Williams wore a suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and Richard Williams checked his phone constantly, as if there were more important things demanding his attention. They knocked on Marcus's door with the imperious attitude of people accustomed to being obeyed immediately. When Marcus answered, they barely glanced at him before demanding to see their daughter. "Sophie," Victoria called into the apartment. "Get your things. We're leaving." But Sophie didn't come running. Instead, she appeared in the doorway with Emma's hand in hers, her chin raised in a way that reminded Marcus of his daughter's stubborn determination. "I'm not going," Sophie said clearly. Her parents stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Excuse me?" Richard Williams said. "I said I'm not going. I'm 16. I have rights." Victoria Williams's eyes narrowed as she took in the small apartment, the second-hand furniture, Marcus in his work clothes. "Don't be ridiculous, Sophie. You can't stay here." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "These people actually care about me." "We care about you," Victoria said, but her voice was cold, automatic. "We're your parents." "No," Sophie said quietly. "You're the people who had me. There's a difference." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Victoria Williams flinched as if she'd been slapped, while Richard's face darkened with anger. "You will. Come with us right now, young lady," he said, stepping forward. "Or we'll have you forcibly removed." Marcus moved to stand beside Sophie, his presence solid and protective. "Actually," he said calmly, "she has legal options. We've already spoken to social services." Richard Williams turned his attention to Marcus for the first time, looking him up and down with obvious disdain. "And you are?" "Marcus Chen. I'm the person who found your daughter freezing in a bus shelter because you abandoned her." The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Victoria Williams's face went pale, while her husband's hands clenched into fists. "We did not abandon her," Victoria said. "We were making arrangements." "For 3 days?" Marcus asked. "While she slept on park benches and went hungry?" Emma, who had been listening with wide eyes, tugged on Sophie's hand. "Sophie was hungry?" she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The innocence of the question, the genuine concern in the 8-year-old's voice, seemed to deflate some of the adults' anger. Sophie knelt down to Emma's level. "I was," she said gently. "But your daddy fed me. He takes good care of people." Emma nodded solemnly, then looked at Sophie's parents with the frank assessment of childhood. "Are you the ones who made Sophie sad?" Victoria Williams stared at the little girl, then at her own daughter kneeling on a stranger's floor, then at the tiny apartment where Sophie had apparently found more love in 2 days than she'd received in 16 years of privilege. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sophie, you're coming home." "This is home," Sophie said, standing up and taking Emma's hand again. "This is what home feels like." The custody battle that followed wasn't easy, but it was swift. Sophie's parents had money and lawyers, but they also had a paper trail of neglect and abandonment that was hard to argue against. Boarding schools, summer camps, nannies who knew Sophie better than her own parents did. The social worker assigned to the case was a kind woman named Janet Morrison, who had seen enough troubled families to recognize the real thing when she found it. She spent an afternoon at Marcus's apartment, watching him help Emma with homework while Sophie made dinner, listening to their easy conversation and gentle teasing. "I've never seen a family bond this quickly," Janet told Marcus privately. "Usually it takes months for foster families to develop this kind of connection." "Sophie isn't really a foster kid," Marcus said. "She's Emma's sister who just happened to find us a little late." The court hearing was held on a rainy Thursday morning that reminded Sophie of the night she'd met Marcus. She wore a dress she'd bought at the same thrift store where Marcus found most of his clothes, and Emma had made her a bracelet from colored string for luck. Sophie's parents sat on one side of the courtroom with their expensive lawyers, while Sophie sat between Marcus and Emma on the other side. The contrast was stark: wealth and power versus love and determination. When the judge asked Sophie where she wanted to live, her answer was clear and unwavering. "With Marcus and Emma Chen, they're my family." The judge, an older woman who had presided over family court for 20 years, looked at the case file, then at the people in her courtroom. She saw parents who couldn't be bothered to show up for their daughter's school events, and a maintenance worker who had taken in a stranger without hesitation. She saw a man who worked extra shifts to afford art supplies for his daughter, and wealthy parents who saw their child as an inconvenience. "Miss Williams," the judge said to Sophie, "are you certain this is what you want?" Sophie stood up, her voice steady and sure. "Your Honor, for the first time in my life, I wake up every morning knowing that someone will notice if I'm sad, someone will care if I'm scared, and someone will be proud of me when I do well. That's what family means, and that's what I have with Marcus and Emma." The judge granted temporary guardianship to Marcus Chen, with provisions for Sophie to have supervised visits with her parents if she chose. The Williams family stormed out of the courtroom without a word to their daughter, but Sophie barely noticed. She was too busy hugging Emma and crying happy tears into Marcus's shoulder. 6 months later, the guardianship became permanent. Sophie had started at the local public high school, where she discovered a talent for art and a love of helping younger students with their reading. Emma had indeed gained the big sister she'd always wanted, and Marcus had found that his heart was big enough to love 2 daughters. They still lived in the same small apartment, still shopped at thrift stores, and ate grilled cheese for dinner more often than not. But they also had family movie nights on the couch, homework sessions at the kitchen table, and weekend trips to the library where all 3 of them would leave with armloads of books. Sophie Williams Chen, as she was now legally named, never heard from her biological parents again, but she discovered that family wasn't about DNA or money or blood relations. Family was about showing up for each other, about choosing to love even when it was hard, about sharing your coat when someone was cold. On the anniversary of the night they met, Marcus and Sophie took Emma to the same bus shelter where it all began. It had been renovated since then, with better lighting and actual walls instead of just glass, but they could still see the bench where Sophie had sat shivering in the rain. "This is where Daddy found Sophie," Emma announced to a pigeon that had landed nearby. "And where our family really started." Sophie smiled, thinking about the girl she'd been a year ago, lost and cold and convinced that no one would ever choose to keep her. Now she had a father who taught her that strength came from kindness, and a little sister who believed that every problem could be solved with enough love and attention. Marcus looked at his 2 daughters. Emma bouncing with 8-year-old energy and Sophie growing more confident and radiant every day, and felt the same sense of wonder he'd experienced that first night. Sometimes the most important moments in your life arrive disguised as ordinary acts of kindness. "Come on," he said, wrapping an arm around each of his girls. "Let's go home." As they walked away from the bus shelter, Emma skipping between her father and sister, Sophie realized that she'd finally learned the difference between a house and a home. A house was a place with walls and furniture, but home was wherever people chose to love you exactly as you are, where your presence mattered more than your past, and where kindness wasn't a transaction but a way of life. Home was Marcus teaching her to fix the leaky faucet, Emma sharing her crayons without being asked, and all three of them choosing each other every single day. 2 years later, Sophie Williams Chen stood in the art room of Roosevelt High School, surrounded by canvases that told stories of transformation. Her latest painting depicted a bus shelter in the rain, but instead of looking cold and lonely, it glowed with warmth from within. Golden light spilled from the windows, and figures could be seen inside sharing something precious. "It's beautiful," said Mrs. Patterson, the art teacher who had become Sophie's mentor. "You've really captured something special here." Sophie stepped back to examine her work with critical eyes. The painting was part of her portfolio for art school applications, but it was also something more personal. A reminder of the night that changed everything. "It's about finding light in dark places," Sophie explained, wiping paint from her hands with a rag that had seen countless afternoon sessions like this one. About how sometimes the worst moments can become the beginning of the best things. The art room had become Sophie's sanctuary over the past 2 years. Here, surrounded by the smell of turpentine and the chaos of creative expression, she had discovered not just talent but purpose. Her paintings told stories of resilience, of found families, of small acts of kindness that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now 10 and full of the dramatic flair that came with double digits. "Emergency at home. Dad burned dinner again and the smoke alarm is having feelings about it." Sophie laughed, quickly cleaning her brushes. Marcus had many talents, but cooking remained a challenge despite 2 years of Sophie's patient instruction. Emma had appointed herself the family's official critic of her father's culinary disasters, providing commentary that was both brutally honest and deeply affectionate. The walk home from school took Sophie through the neighborhood that had become truly hers. She waved to Mr. Kowalski, who was tending his small garden with the dedication of someone who understood that beautiful things could grow anywhere if you gave them enough attention. She stopped to pet the stray cat that the whole block had collectively adopted, leaving food and water bowls on various stoops. This was community in its truest form, Sophie had learned. Not the polished charity galas her biological parents attended, where helping others was performed rather than lived, but the daily choice to notice your neighbors, to care about the elderly woman who lived alone, to make sure the kids walking to school had safe places to cross the street. At home, she found Marcus standing in the kitchen, looking sheepishly at a pan of what might once have been chicken but now resembled something archaeological. Emma sat at the kitchen table, dramatically fanning herself with a homework folder. The smoke detector went off 3 times. Emma announced, "I think it's traumatized." "I followed the recipe exactly," Marcus protested, but his eyes were dancing with the kind of laughter that came from being surrounded by people who loved you even when you failed spectacularly at simple tasks. Sophie surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had become the family's primary cook through necessity rather than choice. "Pizza?" she suggested. "Pizza." Marcus and Emma agreed in unison. While they waited for delivery, they spread homework across the kitchen table in their established routine. Emma worked on a social studies project about community helpers. Marcus reviewed maintenance schedules for the school district, and Sophie sketched ideas for her next painting, while helping Emma with math problems that seemed deliberately designed to confuse anyone over the age of 12. "Sophie," Emma said, looking up from her worksheet with the serious expression she wore when processing big thoughts, "do you ever miss your old life?" It was a question Emma asked periodically, usually when she was trying to understand how families worked, how people could choose each other, instead of just being stuck with whoever they were born to. Sophie had learned to answer honestly but gently, knowing that Emma was really asking whether love was strong enough to last. "I miss some things," Sophie said carefully. "I miss the art supplies I had to leave behind. I miss my room sometimes, because it was beautiful. But I don't miss feeling invisible. I don't miss wondering if anyone would notice if I disappeared." Marcus looked up from his paperwork, his eyes soft with the kind of understanding that came from shared experience. He had learned over the past 2 years that Sophie's wounds ran deeper than he had initially realized. The neglect she had experienced was subtle but pervasive, the kind that left you questioning your own worth rather than your parents' failures. "Besides," Sophie continued, reaching over to ruffle Emma's hair in a gesture that had become automatic, "I never had a little sister before. That's the best part of my new life." Emma beamed with the pride of someone who had always known she was good at being a sister, even before she had one to practice on. The pizza arrived as the sun was setting, painting their small kitchen in golden light that reminded Sophie of her painting. They ate directly from the box, Emma regaling them with playground politics, while Marcus planned weekend projects that would inevitably require more trips to the hardware store than any reasonable person would consider normal. After dinner, Sophie helped Emma with her bath while Marcus cleaned up the kitchen disaster. This was their rhythm now, the comfortable choreography of a family that had learned to move around each other with affection and efficiency. "Sophie," Emma said as Sophie braided her damp hair for bed, "when you're famous for your paintings, will you still live with us?" The question caught Sophie off guard, not because she hadn't thought about the future, but because Emma's certainty that she would become famous was both touching and slightly terrifying. At 18, Sophie was already thinking about college, about art school, about the possibility of a life beyond their small apartment. "I'll always be your sister," Sophie said, instead of answering directly. "Even if I live somewhere else someday, even if I travel or go to school far away, I'll always come home to you and Dad." Emma nodded solemnly, satisfied with this promise. "Good, because Dad still can't cook, and someone needs to make sure he doesn't burn the house down." Later that evening, after Emma was asleep and Marcus was grading papers in the living room, Sophie stood in the small bathroom where she had once watched Marcus fix a leaky faucet, with the same patient attention he gave everything else. She thought about the girl she had been 2 years ago, shivering and lost, and convinced that no one would ever choose to keep her. That girl couldn't have imagined this life, couldn't have pictured herself belonging somewhere so completely that leaving felt impossible even when staying meant giving up material comfort. She couldn't have imagined loving people so much that their happiness became more important than her own security. Sophie looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not the abandoned teenager from the bus shelter, but a young woman who had learned that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. Tomorrow she would submit her college applications, each one a step toward a future that felt both exciting and uncertain. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in a small apartment filled with laughter and second chances, surrounded by people who had taught her that love was not something you earned, but something you chose to give and receive every single day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.